It's that £1,000 million on which we started to negotiate because we want the greater part back. But it's not asking the community for money, it is asking the community to have our own money back.
Another summit, this time in Stuttgart. Britain wanted a long-term solution, and its diplomats had devised a new formula based on increasing the share of value-added tax revenue on which the community budget depended. But first, they had to persuade Mrs. Thatcher.
After about, 2.5 hours argument, she said, "Oh, well, all right, you draft something for me to say tomorrow, and we'll look at it at breakfast at 7. So I drafted something for her to say the next day, and she approved it after going through it very carefully. Always went through it line by line.
Then they just had to win over their European partners. In March 1984, they assembled in Brussels for some full and frank exchanges.
The talks went on late that evening, again in 2 sessions, because the heads of government had their formal dinner together and then tackled it after dinner as they normally do. I don't think there was any real understanding or wish to understand it on the part of our colleagues. Margaret Thatcher struggled pretty hard, and we, foreign secretaries, didn't make much of a job of tackling it either. We adjourned before the heads of government finished, and most of my colleagues were going off to sleep. I said, looking like a wartime waiting station in Crewe Station.
Undeterred, the British pressed on to the summit that June in Fontainebleau, convinced they had the right formula. This time the French proved keener to listen. Was it the chemistry?
It was really de Gaulle who stopped Britain joining, and it was a great tragedy. Ted Heath came in and had a very good relationship with Pompidou, and that definitely helped. Thatcher, well, she didn't really have a great relationship with anyone, but there was a sort of wary regard from Mitterrand.
The rapport was very important because we weren't going to reach an agreement unless there was a sense of common purpose. And at that time, certainly, I think every head of state was anxious to promote their national interest, but there was a wider realization that we should try very hard to reach an agreement for the sake of the European entity.
Or was the President simply mindful that the impending arrival of Spain and Portugal could make France herself a net contributor to the EC?
I mean, they offered her 50%, and she said no. And then the French, much to the Germans' fury, offered her 60%, and she said no. And that was when we had this famous pause.
It was at that point that Margaret Thatcher and I and our officials, David Williamson and Michael Butler, went into a great conclave about it.
We just sat there. And after a bit, she looked at me and she said, "Well, it's time to settle, isn't it, Michael?" And so I said, "Yes, I think so. If you can get just, get the percentage right, we've got the mechanism." And she nodded her head, went back in and did the last bit.
But Mitterrand offered us 65%. And I thought we were getting pretty close to a settlement by then. But Margaret said, no, not enough. And Mitterrand again said, right, we'll have to go back to the council and persuade our colleagues there. And that was the crunch.
When they went back in, and Mitterrand offered up 65%, and she said that it would be very helpful to her politically if she got one more percentage point, and he gave her 66.
President Mitterrand said there were no winners or losers, but he was quick to claim one victory. The French presidency had settled the problems, the 9 were now 10 again, and the community could go forth and expand.
We've got 66% of a certain gap between what we put in and what we get out. It's not quite the whole amount, but it's 66%, and it will last much longer than any previous agreement. It is very complicated. I'm so sorry. It's full of jargon. But I assure you it's a reasonable agreement.